poor fish farmer bravely saved a millionaire's life when his car caught fire on a cold night. He brought him to his small house, but when the millionaire entered, he was shocked to see a photo of a woman in a large frame on the wall. When the fish farmer introduced the woman, the millionaire was so stunned he nearly dropped to the ground. Ethan Miller had built a successful life as a businessman in the real estate world. Now in his late 40s, he was used to the pace of fast decisions, sharp contracts, and the constant buzz of city life. But tonight was different. As he drove through the quiet, unfamiliar countryside, a certain unease lingered in the back of his mind. The small town he had just visited had felt distant, too remote, too quiet for his usual business dealings. The agricultural land he had come to inspect was in a state of disrepair, but Ethan had his mind set on making a deal. The price was right, and with a bit of investment, the land could be a valuable asset for his growing portfolio. As he drove along the empty, winding road, the cold night air pressed against the windows, and the only sound was the steady hum of his car engine. It was past midnight, and the dim streetlights grew sparse as he ventured further from town. He hadn't expected this area to be so isolated. His car's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but open fields on either side. It felt like the world had shrunk to just him and the road, and a part of Ethan felt uneasy in the solitude. Suddenly, without warning, the car sputtered and jolted. The engine died. Ethan cursed under his breath as the car coasted to a halt, the headlights fading. He tried to restart the engine, but the vehicle refused to cooperate. He glanced at the dashboard, no lights, no power. He was stranded. Frustrated, Ethan grabbed his phone from the passenger seat to call for roadside assistance. But as soon as he unlocked the screen, he noticed there was no signal. His heart sank. He could see the faint outline of a farmhouse in the distance, its lights glowing like a beacon in the vast darkness. He would have to walk. Ethan zipped up his jacket against the cold wind and stepped out of the car. The chill bit at his skin as his shoes sank into the wet soil of the road. With no other choice, he set his sights on the distant farmhouse. The path to the house seemed longer than he had expected, and the darkness surrounding him intensified the feeling of isolation. The cold wind whipped against his face, carrying a sense of foreboding. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though he couldn't see anything in the shadows. Despite his unease, Ethan pushed forward, focusing on the farmhouse's lights as his only hope for shelter. His mind, however, wandered to other thoughts. He had always been good at keeping busy, keeping focused on his career and the next big deal. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt a hollow emptiness that he couldn't push away. Success had never filled the void that gnawed at him. He had never allowed himself to stop and reflect, and now, on this lonely road, it seemed impossible to ignore. When he finally reached the door of the farmhouse, Ethan hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the worn wood. There was something unsettling about the place. The silence was oppressive, and the warmth of the house from the inside seemed too inviting, too distant. He knocked softly, but there was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing against him. He was about to turn away when the door creaked open. A woman stood before him, her posture guarded. Yet there was a glimmer of curiosity in her eyes. Her gaze was sharp, assessing, but not unkind. She was a bit younger than him, late 20s, maybe early 30s. But her expression was one of someone who had seen too much, someone who wasn't used to strangers knocking at her door in the middle of the night. "Who are you?" she asked bluntly, her voice cautious but not unfriendly. Ethan removed his hat as a sign of respect, an automatic gesture. "My car broke down a few miles back," he explained, his tone polite but weary. "I have no signal, and I was hoping maybe I could stay the night here until morning. I don't mean to trouble you." The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed his request. She was clearly hesitant. "Are you alone?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Ethan nodded. "Yes, just me. I didn't mean to intrude. I just need a place to stay until I can get help tomorrow." The woman seemed to hesitate, her gaze flicking to the empty road behind him before returning to Ethan. Her life on the farm was isolated enough that she couldn't afford to trust anyone too easily. Yet there was something in Ethan's demeanor, perhaps the exhaustion in his eyes, that made her reconsider. "I have a room outside in the barn," she said slowly after a pause. "It's simple, but it's safe." Ethan's heart lifted with relief. He forced a smile, trying not to appear too desperate. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." The woman opened the door a bit wider, but she still didn't fully let him in. "Come in for a bit," she said. "It's cold outside. I'll get the room ready, but you can have some coffee while you wait." Ethan nodded gratefully and stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The interior was simple, rustic, but well kept. The furniture was old but comfortable. There was a leather sofa that had seen better days and a small shelf with a few books. The atmosphere felt familiar, as though it belonged to someone who had long since learned to make do with what little they had. But something caught Ethan's eye in the corner of the room. A sculpture, illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp, stood in stark contrast to the simplicity of the space. It was a marble piece, beautifully crafted, full of emotion and intricacy. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized it. It was Dorothy's work. Dorothy, the woman he had loved so many years ago. The woman he had left behind when his mother fell ill. The woman he had never returned to. The realization hit him like a wave, and suddenly the room around him felt smaller, the air thicker. His mind reeled. How could this be? How could this sculpture be here in this farmhouse in this small town? The woman, whose name Ethan still didn't know, noticed his intense gaze on the sculpture. She set down 2 cups of coffee on the table, watching him carefully. "That piece is impressive," he said, trying to regain his composure. "Did your mother make it?" The woman nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Yes, my mother was an artist," she said, her voice quiet but proud. "She made several sculptures before she moved here." Ethan felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. His Dorothy had a daughter. The weight of the words hung in the air, suffocating him. His heart pounded in his chest, and he struggled to keep his voice steady. "Your mother. She lived in Europe before she came here, didn't she?" The woman's gaze narrowed again, suspicion creeping into her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice cautious. "She didn't talk much about that part of her life." "Why do you ask?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I think I knew your mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Many years ago. I lived in Europe for a while. I met an artist named Dorothy. We fell in love." The woman studied him intently, her posture shifting as she processed his words. There was something in her eyes now, something searching. "My mother never mentioned you," she said slowly. "She never said anything about you." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had known Dorothy. He had loved her. And now he was sitting across from the daughter he never knew existed. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The woman, Amelia, as Ethan would later learn, stared at him, her expression unreadable. The weight of his absence, the years he had spent away, the child he had never known. All of it crashed down on him. But he didn't know how to make it right. How could he? He had left Dorothy without knowing she was pregnant. And now her daughter stood before him, a stranger. Amelia's eyes softened for a moment, but the hardness returned quickly. "Why weren't you there?" Amelia asked, her voice colder now. "Why weren't you there when my mother needed you?" Ethan's heart ached. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had no excuse, no defense. He wasn't there. And now he didn't know how to begin to explain. Amelia turned away from him, her face tense. "I'm going to get the room ready," she said, her voice flat. She moved toward the door, her back to Ethan. "You can sleep in the barn. I'll show you." Ethan stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. His world, which had seemed so clear and structured just hours before, now felt confusing and uncertain. His past mistakes had led him here to this moment, and he had no idea what would come next. Ethan Miller sat in the small, modest room in the barn, the flickering light from a single bulb casting shadows against the wooden walls. The night had been long, filled with unease and regret, and he couldn't shake the weight of the revelations he had stumbled upon. Dorothy, the woman he had once loved, had a daughter, and that daughter was now standing in front of him, full of questions that Ethan didn't have answers for. How could he have missed this? How could he have walked away from Dorothy and not known that she was pregnant? The guilt gnawed at him as he lay on the hard bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Outside, the wind howled against the barn, and the sounds of the night, the distant cries of animals, the rustling of trees, seemed to reflect the turmoil in Ethan's mind. He had spent so many years running away from his past, from the mistakes he had made, and now, here he was face to face with the consequences. He had walked away from Dorothy without a word of explanation, and now the woman he had left behind was gone, and her daughter was standing in front of him, angry, confused, and full of resentment. He had no idea how to fix any of it. In the silence of the barn, Ethan's thoughts raced. He had learned more in the past few hours than he had ever imagined. Amelia, his daughter, was out there, in the house, just a few steps away, and he didn't know how to approach her. What could he say? How could he explain the years of absence? Could he ever make things right? The thoughts continued to swirl in Ethan's mind until the quiet creak of a door interrupted his solitude. A moment later, Amelia appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the house behind her. She was dressed in simple clothes, her hair pulled back, and her expression was unreadable. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm sorry if I woke you," Amelia said, her voice cold, but there was something else in it. Something softer, almost like exhaustion. "The room's ready. You can stay here for the night. I'll get you something to eat in the morning." She hesitated, as if there was something more she wanted to say, but she turned and left without another word. Ethan didn't move for a long while, unsure of what to do. The room felt too small for the weight of the emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to talk to her, to explain, to somehow make her understand, but how? How could he expect her to forgive him for everything? How could he ask her to accept him as a father when he had never been there for her? The night stretched on, and despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on his body, sleep refused to come. Instead, he lay there, staring at the ceiling, contemplating the wreckage of his past. The next morning, the sun rose over the fields, casting a soft golden glow over the land. Ethan had barely slept, his mind still racing with questions, guilt, and regret. He had to leave. He had to get back to the city, back to his life, back to the world that made sense to him. But before he could do that, there was something he needed to do, something he needed to understand. After a quick breakfast, Ethan stood up, feeling the weight of the morning settle on him. He thanked Amelia for her hospitality, his words stiff and formal, as though he was unsure of how to speak to her. He couldn't read her, couldn't figure out if she hated him or if there was some part of her that wanted to understand. But as he turned to leave, Amelia's voice stopped him. "You're leaving already?" she asked, her tone flat, but there was a hint of something else in her words. Curiosity, maybe, or a quiet sadness. "Don't you want to know more? About me? About my mother?" Ethan paused, the question hanging in the air. His heart skipped a beat. Of course he wanted to know. He wanted to understand everything. Everything about her, about Dorothy, about the life he had missed. He had to know. "I do," he admitted, turning back to face her. "I need to understand. I need to know what happened." Amelia's eyes softened, but only slightly. She nodded, her arms crossed over her chest. "If you really want to know, I'll tell you. But it won't change anything. It won't change what happened." Ethan felt the weight of her words. She was right. He couldn't change the past, but he had to understand it. "I'm listening." Amelia sighed, her gaze distant, as though she was searching for the right words. "My mother never talked much about you. After you left, she raised me on her own. She worked hard to keep everything together, even though she was devastated. But she never told me who you were, who my father was. All I knew was that she loved you and you left. And then I grew up, believing that you never cared enough to come back." Ethan's chest tightened. The weight of her words felt like a punch to the gut. He had abandoned Dorothy, yes, But he hadn't known about Amelia. He hadn't known he was a father. He never knew. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know." Amelia's gaze hardened again. "And you think that makes it better? You think that makes it okay?" Her voice cracked with the bitterness that had been building in her for years. "You left us, and now you're here, asking for forgiveness, asking to be part of my life. But it's too late. You don't get to just walk back into our lives and expect everything to be fine." Ethan stood there, stunned, his mind racing. How could he make this right? He couldn't undo the years he had lost, the life he had missed. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. The silence between them was deafening. Finally, Amelia broke it. "You're right. I don't know what you're expecting from me, but I'm not ready to forgive you. I don't know if I ever will." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He couldn't blame her. He had no right to expect anything from her. But something inside him refused to walk away. He had to try. He had to do something. Over the next few days, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled back into the past, into a life he had abandoned. He tried to put it out of his mind, to focus on his work, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Dorothy's face, and then Amelia's, and he knew he couldn't just walk away again. Not this time. He decided to return to the small town to see Jason again, to learn more about his life. He couldn't ignore the strange sense of connection he felt to Jason, the son he never knew he had. But when he arrived, what he found was even more shocking than he could have imagined. As soon as Ethan stepped into Dorothy's home, he was hit with the undeniable truth. Dorothy was there. She was standing in front of him, her eyes filled with rage. "How dare you show your face here?" she spat, her voice filled with anger. "You abandoned me. You left me alone to raise our child. And now you come back, pretending like nothing happened." Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped for a different outcome, some kind of understanding, but the bitterness in Dorothy's eyes was unmistakable. "Dorothy," he began, his voice soft, but full of regret. "I didn't know. I didn't know you were pregnant. I didn't know." But Dorothy didn't let him finish. "You didn't know?" she interrupted, her voice cold. "You didn't know you had a son?" She shook her head in disbelief. "You're a coward, Ethan. And now you expect me to just welcome you back into my life? Into our son's life?" Just as Ethan tried to gather his thoughts, Jason appeared in the doorway, looking between his mother and Ethan, confusion filling his eyes. "I saved his life, Mom," Jason said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I pulled him out of the car when it caught fire. That's why he's here." Dorothy's face twisted with fury. "Why would you save his life?" she snapped at Jason. "Why would you help him after everything he's done?" Jason was silent for a moment, then turned to Ethan. "You're my father, aren't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's heart raced. The truth was out. Dorothy's anger seemed to explode in that moment. "No," she shouted. "You are not his father. You don't get to be part of this family now. You left us, Ethan, and you will never make up for that." Jason's expression faltered, and for a moment, Ethan saw a flicker of doubt in his son's eyes. But before he could respond, Dorothy turned to Ethan one last time. "I don't ever want to see you again. Leave. Now." And so, Ethan left, his heart heavy with the weight of his past mistakes and the consequences that he could never undo. Ethan Miller couldn't shake the feeling of suffocating despair that had taken over him. The drive back to the city was a blur, the road stretching on endlessly as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. His thoughts were consumed by the anger in Dorothy's eyes, the cold rejection from Jason, and the unrelenting weight of his past mistakes. He had come to the small town to inspect some land, but in the end, he had discovered much more than he ever expected. For days, Ethan wrestled with the aftermath of his encounter with Dorothy and Jason. He tried to throw himself into his work, but the nagging guilt never left him. He had walked away from Dorothy all those years ago, not knowing she was pregnant. And now, years later, he had discovered that he was a father to a son he never knew existed. The wound of his abandonment had opened wide, and the pain seemed endless. But what hurt more than anything was the realization that he might never be able to make it right. Still, something inside him refused to accept that. He couldn't walk away again. He couldn't live with the guilt of not trying. He had to do something for Jason, for his son. After several days of brooding over the situation, Ethan made a decision. He would go back. He would find a way to help Jason, to show him that he wasn't a complete failure. And maybe, just maybe, he could make things right with Dorothy, too. Ethan arrived at the small town late in the afternoon, the fading sun casting long shadows across the fields as he drove toward the farm. His mind was set, and he knew this would be the hardest thing he had ever done. But the feeling of responsibility gnawed at him. He couldn't just walk away and pretend everything was fine. Not this time. When he reached the farmhouse, he parked at the edge of the property and sat for a moment, staring at the house. He could see Jason outside, working with the animals, and his heart ached at the sight of the young man, strong and independent, but clearly burdened with the weight of a life that had been far from easy. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had no idea how Jason would react. Would he accept him? Would he be angry? Would he even want to speak to him after everything that had happened? The uncertainty made Ethan's stomach churn, but he had come this far. There was no turning back. Stepping out of the car, he made his way toward the barn. Jason looked up as he approached, his expression guarded but not hostile. He didn't speak immediately, just watched Ethan with a mix of curiosity and caution. "I'm here to talk," Ethan said, his voice steady but soft, as he reached Jason. "About everything. About you, about Dorothy, about what happened." Jason didn't respond right away. He wiped his hands on his jeans, his gaze flicking to the ground, then back up at Ethan. For a moment, the silence between them felt suffocating. But finally, Jason spoke. "I don't know what you want from me, Ethan," he said, his voice flat, though there was an undercurrent of pain in it. "I'm not sure I even care what you have to say anymore. You left. You left my mom. You left me." Ethan winced, the words hitting harder than he had expected. He had heard them before, in Dorothy's voice, in the bitter rejection of Amelia. But hearing them from Jason, hearing them from his son, made the pain 10 times worse. "I know," Ethan said quietly. "I know I made a mistake. I was selfish. I left without even knowing you existed, and I can never take that back. I wish I had known. I wish I had been there for you and for your mother." Jason looked away, clearly struggling with his emotions. "You can't just show up after all this time and expect me to forgive you. It doesn't work like that. I don't need you, Ethan. I don't need anything from you." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the anger, the hurt, the abandonment. Jason had every right to feel this way. Ethan had never been there for him, and now he was trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. But still, he couldn't give up. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Ethan said softly, "but I want to help. I know I can't change the past, but I can do something now. I want to help you. I want to help your mom. I don't care if you hate me. I just want to make things right." Jason's eyes narrowed, suspicion clear in his gaze. "And what does that mean exactly?" he asked, his voice tight. "You think you can throw money at the problems here and fix everything? You think that's what we need?" Ethan felt a pang of shame. "No, I don't think that's all you need," he said, his voice steady. "But I know that things are hard here. I've seen how hard you and your mother work, and I can help with that. I can help with the farm. I can offer support, financially or otherwise." Jason's expression softened for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by a scowl. "I don't want your money, and I don't need your pity," he said, his voice firm. "We've made it this far on our own. My mom doesn't need you to fix things for her." Ethan's heart sank. He understood what Jason was saying. He had been independent for so long, and the last thing he wanted was someone to swoop in and try to fix things. But Ethan wasn't trying to take over, he was trying to help. "I'm not here to fix everything," Ethan said, his voice low but sincere. "But I can help in a way that matters. I can help give you and your mother some peace of mind. I can help you keep this place going. But if you don't want that, I understand. I'm not going to push. Jason was silent for a long time, his face a mixture of confusion, hurt, and disbelief. Finally, he spoke again. "You think it's that simple? You think just because you offer help, everything is going to be okay?" Ethan took a step closer, careful not to invade Jason's space. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think it's simple. I know it's not. I know I've messed up. But I want to try. I want to try to make things better, even if it's hard." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of their emotions filling the space between them. Jason seemed to be weighing Ethan's words, trying to decide what to say next. But before he could speak, a shout came from the house. "Jason! Ethan!" Dorothy's voice called from the doorway, filled with urgency. "Come quickly, it's your mother." Jason's eyes widened, panic flooding his features. Without a word, he turned and ran toward the house, with Ethan close behind. They burst through the door to find Dorothy kneeling next to her mother, who had collapsed on the floor, clutching her chest. "Mom!" Jason shouted, kneeling beside her. Dorothy's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know what happened," Dorothy said, her voice trembling. "She was fine one moment, and then she just collapsed." Ethan moved quickly, his mind racing. He had no medical training, but he could see the signs of a heart attack. "We need to get her to the hospital," he said urgently. "Now?" Jason looked up at him, panic in his eyes. "I can't afford the hospital," he said, his voice desperate. "I don't have the money for treatment." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'll cover it," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We'll get her the help she needs." They rushed to the car, Jason's mother barely conscious, and within minutes they were on their way to the hospital. The drive felt like an eternity, the tension in the car thick as they raced to get help. At the hospital, doctors took over immediately, working quickly to stabilize Jason's mother. The situation was critical, but she was alive. As they waited for news, Ethan tried to comfort Jason, though he knew nothing he could say would ease the fear in the young man's heart. After what felt like hours, the doctor emerged, his expression serious but relieved. "She's stable now," he said. "We need to move her to surgery immediately, but she'll make it through." Jason let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping in relief. "Thank you," he whispered to Ethan, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan gave him a soft smile. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "I'm just glad we got her here in time." But Jason's gratitude didn't stop there. I didn't think you cared," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you were just here to make things right for you, not for us." Ethan's heart swelled with the words. "I'm here for you. For your mom. I want to help, Jason. I'm not going anywhere." Jason met his gaze, a flicker of something, understanding maybe, passing between them. For the first time, it seemed like the distance between them was beginning to shrink. Ethan Miller stood outside the hospital, the cool night air biting at his skin as he stared out into the distance. The fluorescent lights inside the building flickered through the windows, casting a cold, sterile glow that seemed to reflect the uncertainty that lingered in his mind. The surgery on Jason's mother had gone well, and the doctors were optimistic about her recovery. But Ethan knew that the real battle wasn't just about physical healing. It was about healing the emotional wounds that ran deep between him and his family. After years of avoiding his past, Ethan had finally come face to face with the consequences of his actions. Dorothy, the woman he had loved and abandoned, was still angry, still bitter, and Jason, his son, wasn't sure what to think of him. It felt like everything he had built in his life, his career, his successes, the control he had over his world, meant nothing in the face of the family he had left behind. He had a chance to make things right, but the road ahead seemed long, and every step he took felt heavier than the last. He had done what he could to help Jason's mother, but he knew that wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He couldn't erase the years of neglect, the broken promises, the abandonment. And yet, there was something in him that refused to walk away again, something that kept him pushing forward, even though he had no idea how things would turn out. As the minutes ticked by, Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Jason walking toward him, his face drawn and tired but no longer filled with the same animosity he had shown earlier. Jason stopped a few feet away, his eyes wary but not cold. "Thanks," Jason said simply, his voice quiet but sincere. For everything. For helping my mom." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I'm just glad we got her here in time. You don't have to thank me, Jason. Your family. You don't have to do this alone." Jason shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking to the ground before meeting Ethan's eyes again. "I don't know what to think," he admitted. "I mean, you're here, but I still don't get it. You left. You didn't even know about me until just recently. And now you want to help." Ethan felt the weight of those words sink into him. He had no defense, no way to explain away the years of absence, the silence that had stretched between them. "I know. I don't have an excuse," he said softly. "But I'm here now. I want to make up for what I can, even if I can't change the past." Jason was silent for a moment, his eyes searching Ethan's face, as though trying to find something he could trust. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "I don't know how to deal with all this. I'm not asking you to fix everything. But you can't just show up and expect everything to be fine." Ethan took a step closer, his heart aching with the words he had been wanting to say for so long. "I don't expect things to be fine," he said earnestly. "I know it's going to take time. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Jason. I'm just asking for a chance to be part of your life. A chance to make things right, even if it takes a long time." Jason met his gaze for a long moment, his expression conflicted, and Ethan could see the struggle in his son's eyes. But then, to his surprise, Jason nodded. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Jason said quietly, "but I guess I can give you a chance to prove you're here to stay." Ethan's chest tightened with emotion. "That's all I need," he said softly. "I'll do whatever it takes." For a brief moment, the tension between them eased, and Ethan could see the first flicker of something resembling hope in Jason's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, family conversations, and a constant undercurrent of anxiety as Jason's mother continued to recover. Ethan did everything he could to support Jason, helping with the farm, arranging the finances to ensure his mother's medical bills would be covered, and offering whatever assistance he could without overstepping. Jason had made it clear that he didn't want Ethan to interfere with his life, but there were moments when Ethan could see the burden on his shoulders, the weight of the farm, the responsibilities, the pressure to take care of everything on his own. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Ethan found himself standing outside the farmhouse, staring at the fields that stretched out before him. The wind rustled the tall grass, and he could hear the distant sound of the animals in the barn. He had been trying to fix things for days, but there was still so much left unsaid, so much left to do. His relationship with Jason and Dorothy felt like fragile glass, and any wrong move could shatter it completely. But he couldn't give up. Not now. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Dorothy standing at the edge of the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze distant but not unkind. "I didn't think you'd still be here," Dorothy said, her voice soft but edged with suspicion. "You've done enough. You can go back to your life now." Ethan sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "I can't just walk away, Dorothy," he said, his voice quiet. "I've been running from my mistakes for too long. I can't undo the past, but I'm here now. I want to help you and Jason." Dorothy's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You don't understand," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You left me. You left us, and I had to raise Jason on my own. I had to do everything by myself. Do you really think you can just come back after all these years and make it better?" Ethan took a step forward, his heart aching with the weight of her pain. "I know I can't make it better. I can't fix everything. But I'm here now. I'm here for Jason, for you, for the farm. I know it doesn't fix the past, but it's all I have left to offer." Dorothy's eyes flicked to the ground, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might say something else, something harsher, something that would send him away. But when she looked up, there was something different in her gaze. A flicker of understanding, maybe, or a moment of vulnerability that she rarely showed. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Dorothy said, her voice strained. "I don't know if I ever will. But I suppose it's a start. You're here, and maybe that's all I can ask for right now." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "That's all I need. Just a chance to prove that I'm here, and that I won't leave again." The silence between them lingered, but it wasn't the same heavy silence it had been before. There was something tentative in the air, something that felt like the beginning of healing. As the days passed, things began to shift. The farm, which had been struggling under the weight of its debts and Jason's tireless efforts, began to show signs of recovery. With Ethan's help, they were able to repair the barn, fix the fences, and get the animals back to health. The crops were still a long way from thriving, but there was a sense of hope in the air. Jason worked tirelessly alongside Ethan, his skepticism still present but tempered by the knowledge that his mother's health was improving and that the farm was slowly stabilizing. But it wasn't just the physical work that was changing. Slowly, ever so slowly, Jason and Ethan were starting to rebuild their relationship. They had long conversations late at night, talking about everything from the past to the future. There were moments of tension, moments when Jason's anger flared, but there were also moments of understanding, moments when they could look at each other and see the connection they shared. Ethan knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally heading in the right direction. He wasn't sure if Jason would ever fully forgive him, but he had to believe that, with time, things could get better. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jason turned to him and said, "I'm still not sure about all this, but thanks for sticking around, for helping." Ethan looked at his son, his heart full. "I'm not going anywhere, Jason. I'm here, and I'll keep doing whatever it takes." Jason gave him a small nod, his expression softening for the first time in a long while. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." And in that moment, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wasn't a happy ending yet, but it was a start toward healing, a start toward redemption. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Ethan Miller stood at the edge of the fields, watching the early light dance across the land. The quiet morning had become a reflection of the changes that had slowly been unfolding in his life. The farmhouse, once a symbol of everything he had abandoned, now felt like a place of new beginnings, a place where the past and present could finally start to find some kind of reconciliation. The past few months had been full of challenges, emotional and physical. But as Ethan stood there, taking in the view of the land he had once neglected, he could see a future taking shape. The farm was recovering, and so, in its own way, was his relationship with Jason and Dorothy. It hadn't been easy. There had been tension, anger, and plenty of moments where the weight of past mistakes felt insurmountable. But there had also been moments of understanding, slow shifts in the way they saw each other, and, for the first time, a quiet hope that things could be different. Jason had come a long way since that first tense encounter. His walls were still up, but they were starting to crack. Ethan could feel it in the way Jason spoke to him now, the small moments where their conversations didn't feel so strained. There were still times when Jason pulled away, still times when his resentment flared, but Ethan understood. He had no right to ask for forgiveness, and yet he couldn't help but feel grateful for every little step forward they took together. Dorothy, too, had begun to soften. The cold, sharp anger that had defined her interactions with Ethan in the beginning was slowly being replaced with something else. A cautious respect, perhaps, or at the very least a recognition that Ethan was trying. She hadn't fully forgiven him, and he didn't expect her to, but she had begun to let him in, just a little. The distance between them had lessened, and there were even moments when Ethan could see the woman he had once loved, the woman who had been hurt so deeply by his departure, begin to let go of the past, piece by piece. Ethan had tried not to expect too much too soon. He knew that redemption, forgiveness, and rebuilding trust were long-term endeavors, but it was in the quiet, everyday moments that he saw the most change. The way Jason would nod in agreement when Ethan suggested an idea for the farm, or how Dorothy's expression would soften when Ethan did something simple to help out. These small signs meant more to him than any grand gesture ever could. They were proof that, little by little, he was earning his place back in their lives. Still, the shadow of the past loomed over them, and the road ahead was far from smooth. There were unresolved issues, unspoken words, and a deep, unhealed scar that each of them carried. The relationship between Ethan, Dorothy, and Jason could not be fixed with time alone. It would take patience, effort, and most importantly, the willingness to confront the past head-on. For Ethan, that meant acknowledging the mistakes he had made and accepting the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful. He was interrupted from his thoughts by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Dorothy approaching, her expression unreadable but not as tense as it had once been. She was carrying a basket of freshly gathered vegetables, her hands strong and steady despite the years of hard work. Ethan knew how much she had sacrificed for this place, how much she had done alone, and a wave of gratitude washed over him. He might not have been there for her all those years ago, but he was here now, and that was all he could offer. "Morning," Dorothy said, her voice neutral but not unfriendly. Ethan nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Morning. How's everything?" Dorothy gave a small, tired smile. "It's coming along. Slowly but surely. I didn't think we'd make it this far." Ethan's heart tightened. "I didn't think I'd be here, either," he admitted, his voice soft. "But I'm glad I am." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as though trying to gauge whether his words were genuine. "You've been trying, I'll give you that," she said slowly. "And I'm not going to pretend it's been easy. But maybe you're not the man I thought you were." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. "I'm not the man I was either," he said quietly. "And I don't expect you to forgive me, Dorothy. I know I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I'll keep showing up no matter what." Dorothy studied him, her expression softening just slightly. "I can't promise anything, but maybe we can work through this one day at a time." Ethan nodded, not wanting to push her further. "I'll take that." As she walked past him, heading back toward the house, Ethan watched her for a moment, his heart heavy but filled with a sense of cautious hope. Things were still complicated, still fragile, but there was progress. There was hope, and for now that was enough. The next few days were filled with more work on the farm, more time spent with Jason as they repaired fences, tended to the animals, and made improvements to the property. Jason's stubbornness was still there, and Ethan knew it wasn't going to be easy to win his son's trust. But there were moments when Jason's guard would slip. He would ask for advice or nod in agreement when Ethan suggested something, and those small victories meant more than anything. One evening, after a long day of work, the three of them sat together on the porch. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold as the sun set behind the rolling hills, and for a moment, there was a peaceful silence between them. Jason was sitting on the steps, his legs stretched out in front of him, while Dorothy was at the table, sorting through some seeds for planting. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs as he sat down beside Jason. "We're making progress," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "The farm's looking better." Jason glanced at him, his expression still guarded but not hostile. "Yeah," he said, his voice neutral. "It's better than it was." Ethan nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "That's all we can ask for." Dorothy looked up from her work, her eyes flicking between them. "We'll see how things go once the crops start coming in," she said, her tone still cautious. "But for now, we've got what we need." Jason glanced at his mother, then back at Ethan. "You know, I've been thinking," he said slowly, his voice almost hesitant. "I don't know if I'm ever going to fully forgive you, but I guess I can try. For the farm, for Mom, and maybe even for me." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, the words he had longed to hear finally spoken, even if they weren't perfect. "That's all I can ask for, Jason," he said softly. "A chance. That's all I need." Jason gave him a small, almost reluctant nod, then stood up. "I'm going to check on the animals," he said. And with that, he disappeared into the barn. Dorothy watched him go, then turned to Ethan. I didn't think he'd ever say that, she admitted, her voice quiet but full of emotion. He's been so angry, so hurt. But maybe you're right. Maybe there's a chance for all of us. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It's not going to be easy, Dorothy, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for the long haul. She met his gaze, her eyes soft but filled with something else. Something that felt like hope, or at the very least, a tentative willingness to try. I'll hold you to that, she said, her voice steady but kind. Weeks passed, and the farm continued to improve. The crops slowly began to thrive, the fences were repaired, and the animals were healthy. Jason and Ethan worked side by side, their relationship still a work in progress but gradually improving. They shared more moments of understanding, more silent acknowledgments of the hard work they were putting in together. Ethan knew that there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a place in this world. He wasn't the man he had once been, the man who had run from his past, but he was trying. And that, for now, was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Ethan stood on the porch, watching the horizon stretch out before him. Dorothy came out to join him, and for a long moment, they simply stood there together, the silence between them comfortable. You know, Dorothy said softly, breaking the silence, maybe it's not about fixing everything. Maybe it's just about showing up, about being here. Ethan turned to her, his heart full. I can do that. I'll keep showing up. For you. For Jason. For the farm. She smiled. A soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. That's enough for me, Ethan. As the night settled in around them, Ethan felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had taken the first steps toward redemption. The road was still long, and the scars of the past would always be there, but for the first time in years, he believed that healing was possible.